the X-Men.
And how we were created.
You've probably heard of these guys. And if you haven't heard of these guys, then you've at least heard of this guy. Sorry about that. And if you haven't even heard of him, then do you live under this? I mean, I know the last X-Men movie came out in 2019, and it was really bad, please don't watch it, but a lot of the X-Men movies are really popular and well-known. I would highly recommend watching X-Men, X-Men First Class, and X-Men Days of Future Past if you ever want to see a good X-Men movie.
Warren,
Yeah?
stay focused.
Right, sorry.
Those movies are really good though, and you should totally watch them.
Anyways, the X-Men are a superhero team of mutants who fight to protect both humans and mutants alike. They are made up of many different teams, and each team is made up of many different mutants, who occasionally swap between all of the teams depending on the potential comic book run. Some X-Men are even Avengers. And if you haven't heard of the Avengers, then we really do need to have a talk. These mutants aren't admired heroes though. They're actually feared. In the Marvel world, it was written that humans are afraid of mutants because they were born different and with these exceptional powers that humans could never match up to. So, how did this group of mutants get created, and where did the idea of them being feared come from? Well, the X-Men were created in 1963 by the famous comic book writer Stan Lee and the famous comic book artist Jack Kirby. You may know these two already for their iconic characters like Spider-Man, Captain America, Hulk, and the Fantastic Four. These two were on a generational run in the early 1960s with creating these characters that we all know and love. But after a while of creating characters who were made into heroes through supernatural means, Lee wanted to have heroes that were just born super. He had the idea to make mutants because with them just being born that way, it would make things easier, as he said himself. Lee then had the idea to make them actually hated and feared just because they were different, and he really loved that idea. He also loved that it was a good metaphor for the movement going on at the time he first wrote them up. The first X-Men issue came out in September of 1963 during the height of the civil rights movement, just weeks after Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. Now, why is this metaphor a bad thing? The civil rights movement was a social movement in the United States from 1954 to 1968 which aimed to abolish legalized racial segregation, discrimination, and disenfranchisement in the country, which most commonly affected African Americans. After years of nonviolent protests and civil disobedience campaigns, the civil rights movement achieved many of its legislative goals in the 1960s, during which it secured new protections in federal law for the civil rights of all Americans, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Two very notable figures from this movement are Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, who both were very influential in terms of leading this movement with their philosophies. These two figures have been heavily compared to the two heads of the X-Men franchise, Professor X and Magneto. The two mutants usually oppose each other and fight for very different ideologies. Professor X is said to have mirrored Martin Luther King Jr. in terms of his approaches to advocating for equality. He is known for being the mutant who wants to create a world where mutants and humans can live together side by side. This mirroring gets complicated when it comes to Magneto and Malcolm X. If you go by the simple comic book standards of good versus evil, then that would mean that by comparing Magneto to Malcolm X, you are inherently calling Malcolm X's philosophy bad and diametrically opposed to Martin Luther King Jr.'s, which is not completely true and can cause harm to people's perception of Malcolm X. He was opposed to assimilation, in terms of black people denying their identities in order to coexist with white Americans. This aspect of Malcolm X can be directly compared to Magneto, with Magneto feeling as though mutants should be able to live freely and not have to hide who they are in order to live happily in a world they were born into.
A really cool fact is that similar to how Malcolm X took his famous X last name to reject his slave roots, Magneto actually threw away his human name in order to only be called Magneto, which was a name that represented his mutant powers of magnetic field manipulation and made his mutant identity very known.
Exceptional.
Now, with that being said, these comparisons are very harmful. They demonize Malcolm X, de-radicalize Martin Luther King Jr., and ultimately create this binary that maintains racist thinking of dividing African Americans into two simplistic categories. On top of that, the comparisons distort history as these two white characters, who are, by the way, written as terrible people in some comic runs, being compared to two black civil rights leaders who fought for the liberation of black people, and then appropriating their struggles does the opposite of challenging oppression. And now you may be thinking,
Oh, Warren, it can't get any worse, right?
I'm afraid that it does. When Stan Lee created the X-Men, he created a group of white, straight characters. I would like to add in here that Iceman did eventually become canonically gay, but that's later on. The original team of 5 X-Men are all white, and the only minority there is Jean Grey, being the only female character. Having Jean there, though, doesn't even make a difference because all the characters being white still diminishes the racism, bigotry, and prejudice tied to the experience that these mutants are a, quote, metaphor for. And on top of that, the first black X-Men wasn't created until 1975, which was 12 years later, and was after the civil rights movement had ended.
Do you know what happens to a toad when it's struck by lightning?
With all of that in mind, how are the X-Men interpreted now? Now, despite all of the complications regarding the metaphor that Stan Lee created, the X-Men have actually become one of the most diverse superhero groups ever made. I mean, North Star was Marvel's first ever gay character, and he was an X-Men. Marvel's first ever Muslim character was Dust, and she too was an X-Men. Over time, the X-Men have become a group that is a representation of all minorities and their struggles fitting into society. I mean, as a gay trans man myself, I heavily relate to the X-Men's struggles about being confident in their mutation and being able to actually live in society instead of just feeling like you're simply surviving in it.
Have you tried not being a mutant?
Wow! I wonder where I've heard that exact phrase before! Anyways! With all this being said, we shouldn't forget where the X-Men came from and what they stand for in terms of going against racism, bigotry, and discrimination. The group itself and their cinematic adaptations just need to evolve and step away from the metaphor that overall harms the perspective of the civil rights movement. The group has stepped away from this rhetoric and has become an allegory for all minorities, and the variety of characters really allows for all comic readers to have an X-Men that they can relate to. Now, with everything that I've told you about in this video, I encourage you to look deeper into comic books and comic book movies. Even though they are fiction and present us with these characters that have unimaginable powers, they always reflect the society that we live in, the past that we must learn from, and the future that we must prepare for. A lot of people completely miss the point of a comic and then completely mischaracterize what a character actually stands for. And then they use this character for things that the literal character would absolutely hate. Which is honestly crazy, because how can you be a fan and not actually understand the meaning behind a character that you claim to love? So I really hope that the next time you read a comic or watch a comic book movie, you look for the themes that mirror society. Because media literacy is really important, especially in the world right now. While you take the time to read these credits, I would like to present you with my personal favorite comic book and one that you should 100% read. It's called Alan Scott, The Green Lantern, and oh my god, is it good. I actually cried multiple times while reading it, and it really hits on a lot of real-world themes and events when it comes to being queer. Even if you've never read a comic book before, I would still highly recommend you read it.